Okay, it's MOvember. I'm continuing with my presenting of Pete Walker's work. Today I'm going to pull from chapter 12 from his book, the map, Managing Abandonment Depression. So the Mo is coming along. It's officially day 25, and I'm a bit behind on videos because I was training in some emotionally focused therapy over the weekend. But let's kick into this, and might even do another video tonight on the EFT. So complex post-traumatic stress burdens us with a hair-trigger susceptibility to painful emotional flashbacks. Flashbacks, as we have seen, are layers of defensive reactions to the abandonment depression. These reactions include physical, behavioral, cognitive, emotional, and relational responses to the re-emerging sense of danger and despair that plagued our childhood abandonment. This chapter presents a map of these layered defensive reactions to the abandonment pain. This map shows you which reactions are most important to work on at any given time. It includes a strategy for reducing harmful reactions that are no longer necessary. This strategy involves self-compassionately soothing yourself when you are trapped in a fear and/or depression, so that you do not launch into intensified fear, toxic shame, critic attacks, or self-damaging 4Fs, that's the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn reactions. So cycles of reactivity. This section presents a verbal diagram of the layering of our reactions to an emotional flashback. Experiences of depression and abandonment trigger us into fear and shame, which then activates panicky inner critic thinking, which in turn launches us into an adrenalized fight, flight, freeze, and fawn trauma response. This is how that reactivity takes place in a flashback. A survivor wakes up feeling depressed because childhood experience has conditioned her to believe that she is unworthy and unacceptable in this state. She feels anxious and ashamed. This in turn activates her inner critic to scare her with perfectionistic rants. No wonder no one likes me. I've got to get my lazy, worthless ass out of bed, or I'll end up like that homeless bag lady in the park. Re-traumatized by her own inner voice, she then launches into her most habitual 4F behavior. She either lashes out domineeringly on the nearest person, fight, or she launches busily into anxious productivity, flight, or she flips out on the TV and foggily tunes out or dozes off again, freeze, or she self-abandonedly redirects her attention to figuring out how to fix a friend's problem, fawn. I've just realized now I've messed up my hair. That's what happens when you're working late at night. All this typically happens so quickly that we do not notice the fear and shame or the inner critic. The first thing that we usually begin to notice in early recovery is that suddenly we are engaged in our most typical 4F response. As recovery progresses, we become aware of the critic. Eventually, this promotes mindfulness and the fear and shame that fuel the critic. And finally, in later recovery, we become aware of the abandonment depression itself. Unfortunately, this dynamic is commonly operates in reverse. So I'll read that again. Unfortunately, this dynamic also commonly operates in reverse. This can occur in early recovery when you suddenly notice that you have slipped back into a dysfunctional 4F behavior. This then triggers you into a new self-attacking criticism, which then amps up your fear and shame. This in turn increases your abandonment depression as the process of self-abandonment runs riot. Desperate to escape the death-like feelings of the abandonment depression, the initial cycle revs up again. Depression creates fear and shame, which fuels venomous critic attacks and launches you into fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fawning. Survivors can careen back and forth between these layered reactions, creating perpetual emotion cycles of internal trauma. I believe this process also accounts for the spiraling down feeling that many survivors report having during intense flashbacks. This is a diagram of the dynamic. So really, it's a little thing Pete's got there of abandonment depression leads to fear and shame, leads to the inner critic, leads to the 4Fs. And can go backwards, like he said. Let us look at the case example of how triggering works in the reverse direction. My mega perfectionistic flight type client, Mario, came into the session 5 minutes late. It was the first time he had ever been late in 2 years of therapy. Mario was in a full-fledged flight, sweating from racing up the hill from his parking space a block away. He told me he just could not sit in the couch today. Could he please just pace in front of the couch? I hate being late. I won't tell you. Please don't ask just how fast I was driving on the freeway. Mario compulsively paced, but this drivenness was nothing compared to the speed of his obsessing, as he rattled off many versions of most of the inner critic attack programs listed in Chapter 9, and that's also in a video I've got of the shrinking the inner critic. To him, his being late was merely the tip of the iceberg of his defectiveness. As his rant against himself amped up, he increasingly scared himself with his own words and shamed himself with his parents' disgust. Finally, seemingly exhausted, Mario collapsed on the couch and launched into the first suicidal ideation I'd ever heard from him. He had just landed in the pit of the abandonment melange, depression encrusted with fear and shame, and was sinking to the bottom into a despairing depression of helplessness and hopelessness. This was the real helplessness and hopelessness that had so characterized his childhood. Fortunately, I had been diligently planting seeds about his need to grieve over the last 2 years. For the first time since early childhood, the tears came, and it was the most moving monsoon I had witnessed in ages. He cried for the little forsaken boy he had been. He came home via his pain, to being on his side. The long exile into self-abandonment was temporarily over for the first time that he could remember. When we were then able to look at the cycle of reactivity that had turned into a cyclone, triggered by a traffic jam into the terrible danger of being late, the complex post-traumatic stress disorder launched him into his flight response as he raced to get to my office. The flight response also immediately triggered the inner critic to attack him for his lateness and to catastrophize about the consequences. As it did, he fell deeper and deeper into shame and fear, and then ultimately into the abandonment depression itself. This time, however, Mario broke the flashback with his tears. As his crying released his fear and shame, this in turn defueled his critic and allowed his body to begin releasing the hyperarousal of his flight response. Had he not been able to do this, he most likely would have continued attacking himself with shame-filled perfectionism and fear-fueled drasticizing. He would then have launched out of the session back into obsessively and compulsively racing through his day, driven by his infinite to-do list. The layers of disassociation in the cycle of reactivity. All the layered reactions in the cycle of reactivity are defenses against the abandonment depression. Each layer is also a defense against all of the other layers beneath it. As such, each layer is a type of disassociation. When we are triggered and lost in the 4F response, we fight, flee, freeze, or fawn to disassociate ourselves from the painful voice of the critic. On a deeper layer, the critic is also distracting and disassociating us from our emotional pain. Moreover, fear and shame disassociate us from the bottom layer, the terrible abandonment depression itself. Disassociation, the psychological term for disassociation. That's interesting. Disassociation, the psychological term for disassociation. I'm sort of... disassociation. Okay. Sorry, guys. It's late and I got confused. So let me read that again. Disassociation, the psychological term for... And I still can't get it. That's interesting. I'm going to have to come back to that one, guys. But I want to read on because I love this material. One of the things when I do this stuff, I know in this MOvember, I've done a lot of reading. And I don't overly go back and try and make these things perfect. And we were talking in group tonight. It's, what is it now, 9:35. And we finished the group tonight and we were on the outer critic. For years, I was burdened by having to be perfect, which is impossible. I'm dyslexic, I have ADHD, I've got complex post-traumatic stress from childhood, but I'm not all those things. I'm greater than those things. I'm a child of God, I'm a spiritual warrior. I've learned to reparent myself. And part of that reparenting is that it's don't sweat the small stuff. It's not that important. I know for some of you out there that maybe coming across this, your outer critic might really be doing a number on me. I'm pretty easy for outer critics to do a number on. I swear I'm not perfect. My weight goes up and down, so there's my dyslexia means I read words wrong. So there's plenty of space for people out there to grab onto something with me. You're going to grow spiritually if you hang around me long enough, right? So I don't correct myself on words like that anymore. So if that, this isn't audible.com. I'm reading this out of good faith that you'll buy it, because Pete does refer me clients. We've spoke once. I did an interview with him once. I booked a session with him and said, look, I'm writing a program on your book, but mainly I'm ringing you because I relate. I've got the same trauma types as you and been around the material as long. So yeah, I suppose this is just a little caveat into if your outer critic or inner critic is triggered, especially your outer critic with my humanity, then I hope you can grow through it and find some relief from it, because I know what it's like to live. I grew up with a mother that had a really bad outer critic and it was so painful. So I hope you're able to find some tools in these presentations that will help you with that. So back to the reading, and I'll do my best. Okay, so disassociation then is the process of rendering all these levels less conscious or totally unconscious. As recovery progresses and we learn to stay present enough to the critic to begin shrinking it, then we become increasingly aware of the fear and shame that underlies it. With sufficient feeling into fear and shame, we notice that fear and shame cover up the deadened feelings of the abandonment depression itself. Learning to stay self-supportingly present to the feelings of this depression is the deepest level, bottom of the barrel work of recovery. When we are able to do this, our recovery has reached a profound level. So parental abandonment creates self-abandonment. Once again, we had to disassociate with these layered defenses because we were not developmentally capable of managing the pain of being abandoned. We could not tolerate feeling the fear, shame, and inconsolableness of it. We could not use our anger or tears to release the shame and fear. We could not bear to stay tuned in to the incessantly persecutory critic over which we were powerless. We could only fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. Over time, this elaborate cycle of self-abandonment became habitual. Chronic emotional abandonment devastates a child. It naturally makes her feel and appear deadened and depressed. Functional parents respond to a child's depression with concern and comfort. Abandoning parents respond to the child with anger, disgust, or further abandonment, which in turn exacerbate the fear, shame, and despair that become the abandonment melange. And I hope I get that word right. Sorry, any French person out there. The word that I'm reading, this will be good. It's there, and maybe one day I'll ask a French person. This deconstructing self-abandonment. Because of our parents' rejection, the mild hint of depression, no matter how functional or appropriate, can instantly flash us back into the original abandonment depression. The capacity to self-nurturingly weather any experience of depression, no matter how mild, remains unrealized. Our original experience of parental abandonment has morphed into habitual self-abandonment. We can gradually deconstruct the self-abandoning habit of reacting to depression with fear and shame, inner critic catastrophizing and for affecting out. The mindfulness processes described below awaken the psyche's innate capacity to respond with compassion or depression. From compassion to depression. Mindfulness also helps us metabolize the fear and shame that we were forced to feel about being depressed. Ending our reactivity to depression is typically a long, difficult journey, and this is because our culture routinely humiliates us for any expression of depression. It pathologizes us as if we are violating our patriotic duty to be fully engaged in the pursuit of happiness. This is an American author. Taboos about depression even emanate from the psychological establishment, where some schools strip it of its status of legitimate feeling. For them, depression is nothing more than a waste product of negative thinking. Other schools reduce it simplistically to a dysfunctional state that results from the repression of somewhat less taboo emotions like sadness or anger. This is not to say that these factors cannot cause depression. It is to say that depression is a legitimate feeling that often contains the helpful and important information described below. So depressed thinking versus feeling depressed. Healing progresses when we learn to distinguish depressed thinking, which we need to eliminate, from depressed feeling, which we sometimes need to feel. Occasional feelings of listlessness and hedonia, there you go, the inability to enjoy our usual pleasures, are normal and existential. A modicum of ennui and dissatisfaction are part of the price of admission to life. Moreover, depression is sometimes an invaluable herald of the need to slow down for rest and restoration. When depression is most helpful, it gives us access to a unique spring of intuition, such as that which informs us that once a valued job or relationship is no longer healthy for us. In such instances, we feel depressed because some irreplaceable change has rendered some central thing in our lives detrimental to us. This functional depression is signaling us to let it die or move on. Overreaction to depression essentially reinforces learned toxic shame. It reinforces the person's belief that he is unworthy, defective, and unlovable when he is depressed. Sadly, this typically drives him deeper into abandonment, exacerbating isolation. So mindfulness metabolizes depression. Deep-level recovery from childhood trauma requires a normalization of depression, a renunciation of the habit of reflexively reacting to it. Central to this is the development of the self-compassionate mindfulness. Once again, mindfulness is the practice of staying in your body, the practice of staying fully present to all your internal experience. The practice of mindfulness cultivates our ability to stay acceptingly open to our emotional, visceral, and somatic experience with our retreating into the cycle of reactivity. Stephen Levine's beautiful book, Who Dies, is an enlightening, jargonless, and easily accessible guidebook on learning to practice mindfulness. I would actually say too, and no disrespect to Pete's referral there, but Kristen Nev and her workbook on self-compassion and mindfulness and mindful self-compassion would be another great tool. I'm sort of looking forward next year in 2020 to run a group based on that book entirely. So somatic mindfulness. Because depression in complex post-traumatic stress disorder commonly morphs instantly into fear, early mindfulness work involves staying present to the physical sensation of fearful hyperarousal. This technique is also known as sensate focusing, and it is the practice of feeling we explored in the last chapter. Mild sensations of fear are muscular tightness or tension anywhere in the body, especially in the alimentary canal. Tension in the jaw, throat, chest, diaphragm, or belly also often correlates with fear. More intense sensations of fear are nausea, jumpiness, feeling wired, shortness of breath, hyperventilation, and alimentary distress. Mindfulness also involves noticing the psyche's penchant to disassociate from the uncomfortable sensations. Once again, disassociation can be the classical right brain distraction of spacing out into reverie or sleep, or the left brain cognitive distraction of worrying and obsessing. Over and over, the survivor will need to rescue himself from disassociation and gently bring his awareness back into fully feeling the sensations of his fear. Although sensations of fear sometimes feel unbearable at first, persistent focusing with non-reactive attention dissolves and resolves them, as if awareness itself is digesting and integrating them. So somatic awareness can therapeutically trigger painful memories. Somatic awareness and sensate focusing sometimes opens up memories and unworked through feelings of grief about your childhood neglect and abuse. This phenomenon provides invaluable therapeutic opportunities to more fully grieve the losses of childhood. If more pain comes up than you can digest on your own, please consider getting someone more experienced to help you with this process. With considerable practice, you can begin to exhume from your faith and awareness of the underlying sensations of depression. These are hypo-aroused sensations that are subtle and barely perceptible at first. They then include heaviness, swollenness, exhaustion, emptiness, hunger, longing, soreness, and deadness. These sensations are initially as difficult to stay present to as those of fear. With ongoing practice, however, focused attention also digests them as they are integrated into consciousness. One of the biggest challenges of mindfully focusing on depression is to not disassociate into sleep. Sitting up straight in a comfortable chair can help you keep awake and focused on fully feeling and metabolizing a depression. As practice becomes more accomplished, these feelings and sensations of depression can morph into a sense of peace, relaxation, and ease. On special occasions, they sometimes open to an underlying innate core emotional experience of clarity, well-being, and belonging. Now let me just pull up where I am here. Okay. I just want to see if I want to put this into two spaces, which I think I might. So, no, I might push through. So, introspective somatic work. I began my journey learning how to feel by devoting a half hour daily to feeling the sensations of my fear. This was extremely difficult because I had survived my childhood with ADHD-like busyness. I had run daily marathons of activity to keep myself one step ahead of my fear and my shame-saturated depression. As an adult, I reduced this to half marathons, but I was still a busyaholic despite my relaxed persona. Tuning into how wired I was daunting. In my attempts to become more mindful, I was often exasperated by how frequently my awareness fled my body and went back into thinking or daydreaming. In the first few months, my focus wavered wildly between feeling the tense sensations of my fear and being disrupted by my inner critic thinking. I was assailed by a plethora of catastrophizing thoughts and visualizations. My critic repeatedly misinterpreted my fear as if I was still entrapped in my hazardous family. My critic goaded me incessantly to launch into flight mode. I was so itching to get going that I had strange, tantalizing fantasies of cleaning my apartment, normally one of my least favorite things to do. In the first year of this practice, I frequently had to white-knuckle the handles on my chair to stay somatically present to my feelings. Otherwise, I would have been off and running into self-medicating with excessive adrenalization, dissolving depression by fully feeling it. Gradually, my focused awareness began to metabolize my fear. Many months later, I was typically able to relax the tense, fearful sensations of a flashback within 10 minutes. As I became more successful at digesting my fear, I experientially discovered the rock-bottom underlying core sensations of my abandonment depression itself. Mindful merging with the subtle emotions and sensations of depression is the finishing tool of deconstructing self-abandonment. Over and over, I focused on the sensations of my depression. Occasionally, these sensations were intense, but more often they were very subtle. Often it was difficult to resist the urge to fall asleep, and many times I could not. At other times, I noticed how instantly my depression scared me back into fear. Simultaneously, the sensations of depression also triggered me into toxic shame. Often I would witness myself echoing my parents' contempt: bad, lazy, worthless, good for nothing, stuck in the mud, etc. Blessedly, with ongoing practice, I gradually learned to disidentify from the toxic vocabulary of the critic. I also learned to stay awake most of the time. I then found myself more accurately naming these revisited childhood feelings: small, helpless, lonely, unsupported, unloved. Over time, this in turn rewarded me with a profound sense of compassion for the abandoned child I was. Moreover, I made the wonderful discovery that sensate focusing, when it has been well practiced and developed, is the ultimate thought-stopping technique. When the critic is especially loud and persistent, shifting your awareness from thinking to feeling your sensations is a potent way of coming home to a safer place. It is, as one survivor told me, coming home to rest in the mother of your body. In my current recovery work, I most commonly apply this mindfulness technique to experiences of survival mode depression. For me, the low-grade manifestation of the abandonment depression typically gets triggered by a few nights of poor sleep, which often decreases my energy level and dulls my ability to concentrate. Most of my life, this feeling experience provided rich fodder for my critic. Over the years, however, increased mindfulness allows me to see that I typically function well no matter how tired or introverted I feel. These days, I am sometimes even able to authentically welcome the most exhausted of these experiences as a chance to take a break from my less essential routines. I have learned how to resist my critics' all-or-nothing productivity program and be satisfied with days of getting less done. Hunger as camouflage depression. Feelings of abandonment commonly masquerade as the physiological sensations of hunger. Hunger pains soon after a big meal are rarely truly about food. Typically, it is camouflaged emotional hunger and longing for safe, nurturing connection. Food cannot satiate the hunger pain of abandonment. Only loving support can. Janine Roth's book offers powerful self-help on this subject. Even after a decade of practice, I still find it difficult to differentiate this type of attachment hunger from physical hunger. One often reliable clue is that the sensation of longing for the nourishment of attachment is usually in my small intestine, while physical hunger locus is a little higher up in my stomach. When I can take the time to meditate on this lower abdomen sensation, I often become aware that I am in a low-level flashback. Feeling through this uncomfortable sensation typically resolves both the flashback and my false hunger. I believe this type of emotional hunger is at the core of most food addictions. One of the reasons food addictions are so difficult to manage is that food was the first source of self-comforting that was available to us. And with the dearth of any other comfort, there is a little wonder that we came to over-rely on eating for nurturance. In fact, like Gabor Mate, I believe that attachment hunger is at the core of most addictive behavior, even process addictions. An example of the latter is the sex and love addict's desperate pursuit of high-intensity relating. Perhaps all addictive behavior is our misguided attempts to self-medicate deeper abandonment pain and unmet attachment needs. So pseudo-cyclothymia. On a parallel with false hunger, feeling tired is sometimes unrelated to sleep deprivation. It is instead an emotional experience of the abandonment depression. I believe that emotional tiredness comes from not resting enough in a safe relationship with yourself or with another. This emotional exhaustion often masquerades as a physiological tiredness. Unfortunately, over time, the two can become confusingly intertwined. When our abandonment depression is unremediated, either kind of tiredness can trigger us into fear. This then activates the inner critic, which then translates tired into endangering imperfection, which in turn triggers us into a 4F response. Ironically, overreaching to emotional tiredness eventually creates real physical exhaustion via the process I call a cyclothymic two-step. The cyclothymic two-step is the dance of flight types or subtypes who habitually overreact to their tiredness with workaholic or busyaholic activity. Self-medicating with their own adrenaline, they run to counteract the emotional tiredness of the unprocessed abandonment depression. Eventually, however, many exhaust themselves physically and become temporarily too depleted or sick to continue running. At such times, they collapse into an accumulated depression so painful that they relaunch desperately into flight speed at the first sign of replenished adrenaline. Survivors with this pattern sometimes misdiagnose themselves as bipolar because of their abrupt vacillations between adrenal highs and abandonment exacerbated lows. Also noteworthy here is the futile journey that many survivors undergo treating emotional tiredness with psychologically based methods. The limited efficacy of such an approach, however, typically augments their shame. What's wrong with me? I've changed everything in my diet, my sleep, my exercise regime. I've taken every available supplement and seen every type of practitioner imaginable, and I still wake up feeling dead tired. There is a healthy way out of this cul-de-sac of misdirected strife. It lies in cultivating self-kindness during these inevitable times when you feel tired, bad, lonely, or depressed. In this regard, the notable AA 12-step acronym HALT, Hungry, Angry, Lonely, Tired, can be helpful. Accordingly, I recommend that you focus inside to see if you have flashbacked into the abandonment depression wherever you have experienced a HALT feeling. If you have, you can then work to generate the internal self-compassion and attention described above. Separating necessary suffering from unnecessary suffering. You can sometimes gain motivation for this difficult work by seeing your depressed feelings as messages from your inner child who is feeling as abandoned as he ever was. Perhaps this time you can come to him with your remothering self in a more comforting and protecting way. Through such practice, you can gradually achieve the healing that Buddhists call separating necessary suffering, normal fear and depression, from unnecessary suffering, unconscious self-abandonment to helplessness, toxic shame, complex PTSD, fear, re-traumatizing inner critic acting in, and the 4F acting out. Recovery is progressive. I begin this section by repeating the Chapter 4 section, Stages of Recovery. This section outlines the overall course of recovery. Hopefully you will notice, since you began reading this book, that your understanding of complex post-traumatic stress disorder has been significantly enhanced. I also hope that you sense a greater sense of self-compassion and direction in your recovery process. Although we often work on many levels of recovering at the same time, recovering is to some degree progressive. It begins on the cognitive level when psychoeducation and mindfulness helps us understand that we have complex post-traumatic stress. This awakening then allows us to learn how to approach the journey of deconstructing various life-spoiling dynamics of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Still on the cognitive level, we take our next steps into the long work of shrinking the critic. Some survivors will need to do a great deal of work on this level before they can move down to the emotional layer of work, which is learning how to grieve effectively. The phase of intensely grieving our childhood losses can last for a couple of years. When sufficient progress is made in grieving, the survivor naturally drops down into the next level of recovery work. This involves working through fear by grieving our loss of safety in the world. At this level, we also learn to work through our toxic shame by grieving the loss of our self-esteem. As we become more adept in this type of deep level grieving, there's a storm coming, folks, we are then ready to address the core issue of our complex post-traumatic stress disorder, the abandonment depression itself. The final task here involves releasing the armoring and physiological reactivity in our body to the abandonment depression via the somatic work discussed in this chapter. This work culminates by learning to compassionately support ourselves through the experiences of depression. And finally, we'll see in the next chapter, many survivors need some relational help in achieving the complex tasks involved in the deconstructing each layer of our old pain-exacerbating defenses. So, a Swiss Army knife approach to a flashback. This is the final example of addressing all the layers of reactivity in resolving a flashback. When I started this work over 3 decades ago, I ate very poorly and did not know how to soothe or nurture myself with healthy food. After some years of recovery work, however, I deeply intuited that I needed to cook more in order to take more self-nurturance to the next level, I had not cooked more, however, because I hated to cook. Luckily, I embraced cooking anyway as a labor of love. Nonetheless, cooking was, for a long time, a very trying and unpleasant experience for me. This was, in fact, much like my many years of struggling to get the upper hand on the critic. But, back to cooking, which became a central piece of my self-remothering work. It was not until I understood more about the dynamics of my flight response that I realized how much I rushed around when I was cooking. Via increased mindfulness, I discovered that the smallest unforeseen obstacle could set off what felt like a small electric shock in my chest. Examples of these obstacles include something spilled, or a lid too tight to open, or an unanticipated task, or the clock showing me that I was behind schedule. In an instant, any one of these normal hindrances could send me rushing around the kitchen in a low-grade panic. Whenever this occurred, I would then inhale my meal as soon as it was ready, just in order to get the ordeal over with. This is an example of what a common everyday flashback looks like in adulthood. It is so often minor daily frustrations that trigger us into flashbacks, rather than incidences that repeat the gross insults or ordeals of our childhood. With ongoing recovery work, I realized that anything to do with food could easily flash me back to my family dinner table, the battlefield of my dysfunctional family. Many productive grieving sessions came out of this. They led me to an epiphany that doing anything intricate with lots of steps. It also flashed me back to feeling picked apart by my parents. I subsequently discovered that angering at my parents whenever I was triggered by doing something complicated significantly reduced my fear. There was, however, a huge part of my food trauma that I could not shrink until I started the somatic work described in this chapter. Since then, years of practicing somatic mindfulness has greatly reduced my hair-triggerable anxiety around cooking. This, however, still a work in progress. In terms of the cycles of reactivity, my occasional flashbacks around food and food preparation can look like this. I have 30 minutes to cook and eat my breakfast before I leave for work. I come into the kitchen and, oh no, the sink is full of dishes that I forgot to clean last night. I immediately notice I am about to launch into a frenzied dishwashing when flashback management step 1 rises to the front of my consciousness. I'm having a flashback. I go directly to step 7, the attempt to ease back into my body. I sit in my favourite stuffed chair, close my eyes and bring my awareness to my abdomen, where my anxiety typically makes its most strident charge. I can feel tightness in and just below my diaphragm. I feel afraid and get a picture of my father's big hand squeezing my small intestines. I start to hypochondrize about the possible long-term effects of having this tension in my abdomen. My mindfulness instantly alerts me to evoke the thought correction in step 8. I slowly repeat my current favourite anti-endangerment mantra. I am safe, I am relaxing. I slow and deepen my breath and feel the muscles in my belly as much as I can. I feel the slow cycle of these muscles relaxing and contracting with the ebbing and flowing of my breath. The cycle gradually becomes a more fluid as I attend to it. After about 50 inhalations, I feel a swollen sensation of tiredness diffusing like ink through my body. My gut momentarily retightens to ward off that awful deadening feeling of the abandonment depression, but I surrender to the deadness. I do this because I know the tight feeling of fear and that it will soon morph into the screaming critic exonerating me about being late. I say no to the critic's siren call of "you can do this if you hurry," tempting me back to flight. I stay with the dead and tired, lifeless feeling and try to feel it and more welcoming it. I sense myself beginning to become one with the depressed sensation. Because I am so well practiced, the depression starts to gradually morph into a widening sense of relaxation. It senses throughout my body and my body begins to feel like the easy chair. I look at my watch. It has taken about 20 minutes of my precious time. I realize my critic is trying to sneak back in and goading me with the remark, "It has taken 20 minutes of my precious time." I disidentify from the critic and shift into my refathering self and thought correct the critic. "It's okay, Pete. This is small potatoes. You are not in danger." Step 2 of the 13 tips of dealing with a flashback. And this is definitely no emergency. I take a moment with the angering part of the grieving step 9 and reinforce my boundaries against my internalized parents. Screw you, Helen Mum, and Charlie Dad, for frightening me so much about making mistakes that I freak out when things don't go perfectly. Oh, that got a few nice tears. What a relief. How many times I've been stuck in that drivenness and not known how to stop. I return to the thought correction. So, like I was saying, Pete, it's okay. You always show up at the office an hour early anyway. You can take 20 minutes off the routine. You can stay in this relaxed state a bit longer. Still have time to get everything done in a relaxed manner. I feel a sense of triumph. I sometimes see in my clients when they have worked hard to successfully manage and resolve a flashback. It worked. This time I broke the cycle and did not let my triggering flight response get much further than some momentary rushing. I stopped the cycle of reactivity by devolving into an inner critic diatribe against myself. I didn't indulge the outer critic and let it make me try and pin the undone dishes on my wife. I chose to stay with the depression. I bypassed the shame and fear that I had gotten stuck in 10,000 times before when I could not accept my current state of being. I refused to abandon myself like the sinking ship I thought I was, like Helen and Charlie abandoned me as a kid on a daily, hourly and yearly basis. I am also happy to report that I now cook regularly and triggering is relatively rare. I have even gotten to enjoy my own cooking so much that I rarely eat out. So that's from Pete Walker's Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder from Surviving to Thriving. Go to his website, lots of great stuff. That chapter, the map managing the abandonment depression, I hope it was helpful. Another long read, but I hope that you've been able to just sort of go for a walk or digest that. It is MOvember. Please be gentle with your heart. And if you can donate, I understand there's plenty of great charities right now, and there's been fires and there's trouble around the world. So if you've got it, $10, $20, give it. If you haven't, keep it, and please put it to great use of self-care. And I will have a bunch more videos before MOvember's out. Day 25. Hopefully this mow will let me get some wax. I've been waiting to use my Perry Nobleman mustache wax. Not really there yet. So take care. Good night.